here's the 4 subnets that we've created: 1.0, 1.64, 1.128, and 1.192, all with /26 subnet masks. But our next phase is to identify the usable addresses within these subnets and ultimately the directed broadcast address. Remember, we can't hand out the subnet ID to anybody, and we can't hand out the directed broadcast. Everything in between those 2 values, we can hand out to the end stations inside of our local area networks. So the first usable address will always be the next address after our subnet ID. So in this case here, the first usable address is going to be 192.168.1.1. In this example, we're going to have 192.168.1.65. In this case, we're going to have 192.168.1.129. And in this example, we're going to have 192.168.1.193. So finding the first usable address is a very, very simple process. Just add 1 to the subnet ID, and you know the first address that you can start assigning to those end stations. But now, what is the last usable address? This is where things get a little tricky because you don't know right now the exact last address in the subnet without working backwards. So we have to work backwards right now from the next subnet ID to figure out what is the last address within the subnet. Now, the last address doesn't mean last usable address. So it's always best now to find your directed broadcast address. So what is the very last address in the subnet? It's going to be 1 less than the next subnet ID. So I want you to focus right now on this address here. If you focus on this particular address, what is 1 less than this address? 1 less than the address. Yeah, 64 minus 1 is 63. So the very last address in the first subnet is going to be 1 less than the next subnet ID. So we can say it's 192.168.1.63. So that is going to be your directed broadcast address. Directed broadcast. So now if we're trying to figure out what is the very last address, then it's just 1 less than the directed broadcast address. So 1 less, which means we're going to have 192.168.1.62. So our range of values right now for the first subnet that we can hand out to end stations is 192.168.1.1 through 192.168.1.2. So now let's figure out the very last usable address for this subnet right here. Sorry, the last usable address for this subnet right here. So we're going to first find out the directed broadcast address. So take this and subtract 1 from it. So take this and subtract 1 from it. What's the value that we get in this particular case? It's going to be 192.168.1.127. So that's the directed broadcast address for the second subnet. Now subtract 1 from that, and we'll get our final address that we can use, 192.168.1.126. So I can hand out addresses in the second subnet from 192.168.1.65 through 192.168.1.26. Let's shift our attention now down a little further in this example. So we'll move down to figuring out the directed broadcast address for this subnet by analyzing this particular network right down here. And in this case, 1 less than that is our directed broadcast address for the third subnet, so 192.168.1.191. It's going to be our directed broadcast address. And then that means the last address is 192.168.1.190. So I can hand out addresses to end stations within that range of 129 to 190, and they'd be in the third subnet. And to figure out the last one here, oh my gosh, I have nothing to utilize. I have nothing to utilize as my value to work backwards from. Or do I? Do I? Let's think about what the next subnet would be. The next subnet would actually be what? Well, what did we say we're counting by here? We said we were counting by 64 in the fourth octet. That's how we came up with these subnet IDs. So what's 192 that we see right here plus 64? Well, that's 256. Can I have a value of 256 in the fourth octet? The answer to that is no, I can't. I can't. So if I can't have 256, and the highest value you can have is 255, 256 actually becomes what? It becomes 0, doesn't it? It becomes 0. Think about your odometer in your car or your truck or your van, whatever you drive. Maybe it's your motorcycle. When you hit a value of, let's say, 999, what happens? Do those 9s become 10s? No. The 9s go back to 0, and then you add another column, and you increase that column by 1. So now you're at 1,000. Same idea here. Once I hit 255, well, then that has to become 0, and then you have to modify the next octet. So our next subnet ID would actually be 192.168.2.0. 2.0. So if we roll back 2.0, we'd end up with 1.255. 1.255, because if you take the 0 and roll it back, you get 255, which means that if I roll back that column, that octet, I got to roll back the one before it. Got to go down 1 there as well. Just like your odometer, if you're at 1,000 and you roll back all those zeros and 1,000 to 9s, well, you're not rolling back to 1,999. No, you're rolling back to 999. So that 1 has to become a 0 as well. So same idea here. You're going to take the 0, turn it back to a 255, take the 2, roll it back to a 1. And so our very, very last address and our last subnet ends up being 192.168.1.255. That's our directed broadcast address in this case. And then the very last address, 192, for the fourth subnet is 168.1.254. So there's a full analysis of the subnet IDs, the usable addresses within each of those subnets, and the directed broadcast addresses.